And if we look closer to the black, burnt, charred wood, there's a white object on that piece of wood. That white object is later determined to be human bone.
You heard that right, human bone. This is one of my favorite segments, Exhibits Marked, because as a self-proclaimed trial nerd, it's very important to know what this jury has to consider, what evidence been admitted that they can really see, touch, smell, so to speak. Still with us, criminal defense attorney Tamara A. Walker. We also have criminal defense attorney Phil Hamilton. Thank you both for staying with me. Before we go through some of this evidence, I want to listen to some of the testimony by one of the forensic scientists in this case.
And slide 20.
20 is an image taken after the application of luminol. You can see there that there's many more stains that are visible now due to the application of the luminol. These stains are very similar in characteristic, size, and shape as the visible stains that you could see and that were already marked.
Are you able to say anything about the pattern of or splatter of these stains?
These look like stains that were drip utilized in or that are produced from gravity alone acting upon the bloody source with the blood dripping straight to the floor. There were a couple of stains that you can see some movement toward the bottom right that are somewhat smeared. These could be consistent with swipes or wipes.
Phil, in terms of evidence presented to this jury, you're not just hearing a forensic scientist say dripping of blood. They see where it dripped on the floor scientifically. How impactful is that to a jury in your experience?
Super impactful because it humanizes the scene, Ashley, right? You hear a lot of this testimony in the abstract. You know, you sit through the course of voir dire, opening statements. When you start to get to the point now where not only are you listening to evidence, but you are being able to see essentially evidence of death, right? What starts to happen with every blood drop that you see illuminated by that luminol is that you start to think of someone's life, right? And that someone's life, and most likely the end of it, is what ultimately led to what we are seeing here, essentially glowing in the dark on the floor. And I think in many respects as a juror, that's when it starts to hit you that even though I'm in trial and I'm a juror, this is no longer theater, this is real. Somebody died, and it's my job as a finder of fact to kind of piece this together. That blood glowing in the dark is a big piece.
And Tamara, we were talking a little bit earlier about the reality of this is a circumstantial case, but that evidence that they just saw and where the blood was dripping on the floor is in the home where the defendant lived with his parents. Those were the only 3 people who lived in that home. Isn't that a piece that can connect the dots to say there's probably no other reasonable explanation as to how their blood would have gotten there?
Oh, absolutely. I think that not only the blood splatter, which Phil pointed out, and I agree with 100%, it starts to drive home the reality and the importance and the fact that, you know, lives were lost apparently at this home at the hands of their own son, no less. So I think that not only is it an important exhibit for the jury, but it really drives home the point that everything must be examined. And once you connect the dots, especially with some of the other physical evidence you pointed out, that's when you start to see the whole picture.
Connecting the dots to see the whole picture leads perfectly to the next exhibit that's been introduced into evidence for consideration by the jury. An image of a white object on the charred wood in the fireplace. We're going to look at it together. That's been identified as bone. And so now if we're able to see that picture and look at it, now if you would, Phil, tell me how, as a defense attorney, how do you change the natural inclination to put together blood on the floor caused by drippings, bone, human bone in the fireplace?
There are some cases, Ashley, where you are just working uphill as a defense attorney. And I think even going back to our discussion about the blood, you know, in there, I'm not necessarily as a defense attorney saying this is super problematic. It's a problem that we have to deal with, but nevertheless, there's no time stamp in terms of when that blood was ultimately, left there with on the floor. However, it got there. Somebody could have cut their hand working in the basement. When you start to combine that with bone, now I'm starting to get into the super problematic area, and I have to now start, nevertheless, trying to find a way to, present the theory that that bone still, nevertheless, is not necessarily indicative of the burning of this my client's parents or anything along those lines, but nevertheless you're starting to get into a realm at that point where your case is becoming super problematic and really uphill. It just is.
And this is a case, it's not always true. I didn't always used to see cases where there was this much physical evidence, but this happens to be a case where so far the prosecution has presented a lot of physical evidence. So we know that the medical examiner testified that the death of Bart, the father, was caused by 3 gunshot wounds to his back. So, Tamara, comment on the fact that gun magazines were found in the wall of the basement in the home belonging to the Haldersons, again, where Bart and Krista, the parents, lived, along with the defendant, their son Chandler, behind the insulation. And the testimony was they saw that there was a place, and then they pulled down all the insulation. And look at that. There were 3 magazines. Not only that, testimony that 2 of the magazines had 20 bullets. The 3rd magazine only had 15 bullets. Tamara, what are your thoughts about this piece of evidence?
Oh, this is exactly what I was referring to when I said connecting the dots. Now here we go from a prosecution standpoint. And let me point out that I'm also a former prosecutor. So from that standpoint, this is the type of scenario that you look for as a prosecutor. From the defense standpoint, however, in this day and age, people want the CSI. They want the ballistics report. We need to know, do those bullets match the bullets that were found in Bart Halderson? We need to know what was the time frame. People need that scientific link sometimes to really feel comfortable given our current climate with social media and some of the entertainment programs that we all enjoy. But from a prosecution standpoint, this is, what you want. These are the exhibits that really help build your case.
And Phil, is it possible to really create reasonable doubt by pointing out anything that's not introduced? And by that, I mean, you have the magazines. What if there are no fingerprints on them? And what if someone says, well, he must have been wearing gloves, but what if there's no evidence of any gloves being found? Are those the kind of holes that you want to poke in this evidence as the defense?
I mean, not only are they the holes that you want to poke, in many respects, they become the whole of your case, right? Like these inconsistencies and anywhere that you can find that the state is not able to, prove up fact with respect to their theory. Of course, in many respects, the defense theory here is kind of left open in terms of how ultimately, these individuals died here, right? So to the extent that it was someone else that potentially came in and committed the crime, to the extent, as you just noted, if you don't have the DNA with respect to, coming from the gun, if you don't have fingerprints, you have a plausible argument with which you at least can walk into summations, right? And actually put forth in terms of holding the state, highly to its burden. That being said, as was just noted, we have a lot of pieces coming together for a puzzle that even if we don't necessarily have every piece, from the defense standpoint, you're a little bit worried about what the jurors can potentially see.
All right, one last piece of evidence we want to talk about. It's by no means all the evidence that's been presented, but the parents' cell phones were found wrapped in foil, and along with the cell phones, their identification for each of the parents. I guess my question, I'd like each of your thoughts. And first, let me start with you, Tamara. Why do you think these were wrapped in foil?
That's an interesting question. That's an interesting one. I know that there are some conspiracy theories that foil can defeat some tracking devices. There's a program, Better Call Saul, that's actually about a lawyer. And his brother was a lawyer, and he developed some sort of mental issue dealing with technology and its impact. And that was something that he would often do, is wrap things in foil to block those signals that the perception is can be blocked by foil. I don't know if that's accurate, but perhaps that's what that is. That's an interesting piece of evidence that, I actually think it could be argued both ways. But that's something you don't see every day, that's for sure.
Yeah. Do you know, I never knew that movie had the character in it was an attorney. Just an interesting side note. Phil, what are your thoughts about the fact that it was wrapped in foil?
Hey, I second Tamara here. I mean, of course, we know that nobody is trying to keep cell phones fresh. So to the extent that you have these phones wrapped in foil, there is an indication there. Let's just be frank, a little bit of foul play. And to the extent that that play occurred, it comes across kind of rudimentary, kind of not well thought out, and almost from just a lay standpoint, someone who thinks that they're smarter than they really are, right? Someone who thinks that they can get away with these kinds of things, where if we kind of look at the way in which the prosecution is presenting their case, not just in terms of what happened, but in terms of who this defendant is, that's kind of another piece that fits if I'm on the prosecution side. With respect to the defense, again, I don't know who wrapped those phones up, and to the extent that it hasn't been proven, you got to go there with the jury as well. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's, prima facie proof of your client's guilt, but nevertheless, a bad puzzle piece.
It's interesting, one word that you said, because viewers have commented that they do feel like this defendant thinks he's smarter than everyone else. So who knows the reasons, but we're going to continue to provide live coverage of that trial next week. Coming up, the accused Oxford High School shooter was back in court today.